Thank you so much for coming. For those who stayed on, thank you for staying. For those who've just come, you are very welcome. Tonight, we're going to talk about Grantown's industrial past. Now, some people say, industrial? Grantown? Never! Well, now let's see. I'm hoping that this is being recorded so we can then put it together and ultimately get them online and so on for those who can't make it. But Grantown was in fact founded as a manufacturing town. This April 1765 handbill from James Grant, later known as the Good Sir James, in the name of his father, who was then still living, invites manufacturers, tradesmen and others to come and settle in the new town. Is everyone okay for sound and vision and all of these things? Good. Industry of all kinds was of course not new to this area. On the site of the new distillery, archaeologists discovered a late Iron Age rural agricultural settlement comprising of at least 6 roundhouses and associated structures and activity areas, evidence for the everyday activities such as quern production, grain processing, iron working, smithing and smelting are all there. As well as that, through the ages, agriculture and forestry were hugely important industries. In many ways, it's the maps and plans, the stories and the names that tell us of the industrial past of Grantown. And we're also indebted to the vast collection of letters and documents in the Scottish Records Office, the Seafield collection, and particular to George Dixon, who's accurately transcribed a huge number of these, which we're trying to bring to Grantown so we can actually get typed up, digitised and gradually available. One such paper, partly in the hand of Sir James Grant, records the encouragement by premiums for different kinds of manufacture, and for excelling in husbandry, etc., letters of credit and advance of money to an innkeeper, merchant, linen, woolen and stocking weavers and manufacturers, wrights, smiths, shoemakers, tailors, etc., to settle and make their residence there. By 1791, the population had risen to above 300 and also included coopers, bakers, schoolmaster and a physician. The first building in this new town was the house and workshop of John Grant from Rothimarcus, a weaver, who set up in Grantown, strongly supported by the town's founder. On this site now stands Morley House, which was built in 1851 as a bank and saw the demolition of that first house, which was by then in a fairly ruinous state. The house and workshop of John Grant, weaver, manufactory, 58 foot long, 20 foot wide, 9 foot walls at one end to accommodate 2 stories, with a semi-basement weaving shop. The remaining 35 foot frontage was to have 7 foot walls. Internally, there was a small cellar under the centrally located kitchen with its hanging lum, a stair and a principal room at one end, and garrets for sleeping accommodation along the full length of the building. All 5 windows were to be fitted with wooden shutters, and not long after that, the whole building was to have 2 stories. And I'm saying to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful if somebody would make a model of that? Because a wee bit of imagination, because how you have 9 foot walls and 7 foot walls and subterranean bits, I don't know, but based on that and other buildings, it would be brilliant to have a model of Grantown's first house. Challenge for somebody. Anyway, in 1765, on the south side of the square, originally earmarked for a school, was the site which became a linen manufactory. This was the origin of the present Grant Arms Hotel, for after only a few months, the linen business, run unsuccessfully by Lewis Grant of Dalmeny, became, amongst other things, a brewery. Well, what else would you do with a business? 1770, 1775, 1776, 1777, 1778, 1779, 1780, 1791, 1792, 1793, 1794, 1795, 1796, 1797, 1798, 1799, 1700, 1701, 1702, 1703, 1704, 1705, 1706, 1707, 1708, 1709, 1710, 1711, 1712, 1713, 1714, 1715, 1716, 1717, 1718, 1719, 1720, 1721, 1722, 1723, 1724, 1725, 1726, 1727, 1728, 1729, 1730, 1731, 1732, 1733, 1734, 1735, 1736, 1737, 1738, 1739, 1740, 1741, 1742, 1743, 1744, 1745, 1746, 1747, 1748, 1749, 1750, 1751, 1752, 1753, 1754, 1755, 1756, 1757, 1758, 1759, 1760, 1761, 1762, 1763, 1764, 1765, 1766, 1767, 1768, 1769, 1770, 1771, 1772, 1773, 1774, 1775, 1776, 1777, What is now the Garth Hotel was originally built by the Laird of Grant's clerk, also James Grant, 1769. 1776, it was bought over by Sir James for a woolen manufactory. Thomas Cornish from London was installed there, thanks to some £1,200 of Sir James's own money. Now, if somebody wants to put that into today's money, it's an awful lot. 42 employees, male and female, worked there, weaving and knitting stocking. Now, I'm not quite sure what stocking is, but it's some sort of material which presumably made stockings. But someone can keep me right on that, please. None of these businesses was particularly successful, partly accounted for by distance from markets, partly by industrialisation in the south, and partly, as Mrs. Anne Grant of Lagan, in her letter of August 1785, following a visit to James Grant and Castle Grant, suggests, Strathspey is quite a civilised country compared to this. Sorry if there's anyone from Lagan here, or Newton Moor, or wherever. Anyway, and has a good, neat village in it, where the father of the district has been cherishing some exotic manufactures, which do not seem to find the soil congenial. In fact, a Highlander never sits at ease at a loom. It's like putting a deer in the plough. Weaving, of course, did not die out. The early records show a James Seaton, stocking weaver, in 1789 on Lot 2 South Side, John Grant, weaver, 1799 on Lot 25 North Side. In 1807, Peter Stewart, weaver, had half South Side tenement, and in 1808, George Ellis, weaver, with half of a park that I think was Clover Park, although that doesn't mean anything to me. The home and workplace of several weavers is recorded in the name Weaver's Close, which, a very blurred picture, I'm afraid, best I could manage. However, it's now Southwest High Street. Until around 1880, one of the houses beside Weaver's Close appears to have been occupied by a weaver, James Grant. In 1882-83 valuation roll records the owner as Peter Grant, Glamorganshire, heir of John Grant, weaver, per Mrs. Grant. And the Grantown guidebook of around 1911 carries the advert of William Glass and Son, established over half a century, probably mostly tweeds, I suspect. And later, a knitwear factory was established briefly on the industrial estate. But it's a sad aside to this story in this region, and it was captured by Maureen Shaw's research, and that's some of her collection of old tartans and materials. 90% of the rough linen, called harn, at this time was shipped to the plantations to clothe slaves. Associated with the linen industry were the processes of creating the lint from the flax and finally bleaching the finished material. The area known as Burnfield was the town's first bleaching green, and there was a bleach field out at Cragan along the lint mill. Available records showed that there was a George Crawford bleacher at Grantown, and possibly Elgin, from the 1780s to the early 1800s, and he was succeeded at Cragan by his son Walter, and then around 1803 by a Mr. Johnston Jr. from Elgin Bleachfield. I wonder if that's anything to do with the Johnsons of Elgin. Still research for somebody. And these are all current photographs of what remains of the mill and the buildings and so on. In fact, they're this week's photographs, right up to date. Don't say that the society is rooted in the past. We are well up to date. Else with our photographs. Anyway, an advert in the Aberdeen Journal of July 25th offered to let or lease a complete, well-going lint mill, a large house thereto adjoining for bleaching machinery, and a dry house, Also a bleaching green, with several lines for laying cloth on and canals between containing water at Cragan, within 200 or 300 yards of the banks of the Spey, about a mile from the village of Grantown, in a most agreeable, warm and delightful situation, with a south exposure and surrounded at a small distance with natural and planted woods of various kinds. A situation equalled by few and excelled by none in the counties of Inverness or Murray. It's supplied with a constant sufficiency of fine, soft, clear running water for the lint mill, bleaching machinery and bleach field. There's no other lint mill within 20 miles around, and considerable quantities of flax, annually for several years past, have been raised in Strathspey, which, and most of what is raised in the neighbouring counties, is manufactured at this mill. And also there are 2 excellent farms contiguous to the said mill to let either separately or together with the mill, etc. It would be a wonderful site to explore and to clear away some of the vegetation and to actually see the buildings and to try and piece together what was there, a little archaeology for someone. The mill buildings, having been left whilst the owner was visiting Castle Grant, were visited in turn by vandals who set the wooden wheels in action, and the heat generated from the unattended machinery overheated, caught fire and gutted the building. However, presumably it was rebuilt as the farm of Kirkton of Inverallen and Bleachfield, with the houses thereon, was leased by Johnson in 1803. The lint industry has a link with another entirely different and at that time an illegal industry prevalent in those early years in the north. The making of whisky, the water of life, using that same fine, soft, clear running water. Most important part of the process, as you all know from your work in your back garden on making hooch, was the worm, the coil where the liquid was cooled and distilled. And this was the treasure sought by the exciseman in order to close down the whisky-making cells. If surprised and discovered, the distillers would try to get rid of the worm, and sometimes that meant throwing it into the retting pond, which was associated with the mills and the bleacheries and so on. And it was a foul-smelling, stagnant pond where the flax stalks lay rotting before being stripped, and into which no self-respecting exciseman would venture. By 1825, Grantown had its own short-lived but legal distillery, and once again, we're now part of that industry. There's another dam near the curling point, the ponds, just the other side of the golf course, east of it, and there are stones marking the wall of the old dye works. Now, the most famous of Grantown's dyers was one Jamie Dyer. Now, Jamie was an outstanding character in many ways. He opened his shop in the High Street and was very successful. He was a very keen and successful angler and sold rods and fishing tackle of all kinds. He was married twice, and by his first wife he had 3 sons. Brilliant men they afterwards were, and a daughter. When in his 70s, he again married a comparatively young woman, who gave him 2 more sons. Mr. Duncan, the chemist over the road, told a story which is worth retelling. He told how Jimmy Dyer marched in one day and said, "Mr. Duncan, I'm celebrating my 80th birthday. And this morning, my wife presented me with a young son. I then went down to the river and took home a £20 salmon." Now, does anyone know who can beat that? Not for us all yet. A close known as Dyer's Close was further down towards the West End. There's apparently a Dyer's Stone near the new bridge. The channel on the banks of the Spey between the old and the new bridges, just down below the road, was a lathe for dye works. The work here was stopped by the factor, old Congash, maybe because he was an ardent fisherman. The trade, it was said, ran in families, for there was a cousin, a Lachlan dyer, in Dublin Bridge. And they're very difficult to photograph, but when you're walking along that road, and I wondered for a long time how come there was this dip all the way along from the new bridge right the way down towards the old bridge. Well, that was the lathe. There were, of course, many other trades and industries which grew in the new town, not all of which were either healthy or popular. William Findlay carried on a tanning business in Burnfield, and finding it disagreeable to the inhabitants, stated that he would move the tan yard to the low end of the Black Park. Now, that is the area down below where the primary school is now. Evidence, Black Park. Sir James Grant promptly agreed, saying, "My coach and horses would scarcely pass it when I went down last." Nasty smelly place for Spark. Whilst the Black Park, as we know it, became the market stands later in the 19th century, the original marketplace was in the square. Of course, the agriculture industry was much older than New Grantown, but by 1766, the 9 annual fairs of the neighbourhood were moved to the town, and there are in existence graphic accounts of market days. And on the agricultural theme, the Killintraw allotted lands. Sir James, of course, was one of the key players in the Scottish Enlightenment and the Agrarian Revolution and the improvements. In a memorandum of 1787, we read, "At the commencement of the town, Sir James enclosed and ploughed up parts of it, and after letting it lie for some time exposed to the air, lined and laid it down with turnips first, and then barley and grass seeds, after which he set it in divisions for the people of the town at from 2 and 6pence to 5 shillings per acre." And so we have all the fields down towards the West End, which are marked on the map as the Killintraw allotted lands, hence Killintraw Crescent and so on. The farming tradition, of course, continued through the years with many associated industries, including saddlery and dairy. And here, an old photograph of Wem's Dairy down West End of the High Street. Another part of the industry was carried on by local millers. Of note, we have Castle Grant, and we have of Garrow's Mill by Castle Grant and the Cragan Mill, both of which are fine, upstanding buildings still. Now, the meal dealers were essential to the community and worked outside the remit of local shops. You couldn't go into a shop and buy your meal, you got it from the meal dealer. One such dealer lived in High Street, West End, 107, 109, on the east side of Dairy Close. And this was another site with multiple occupiers in 6 or 7 houses, having a range of occupations: carpenter, tailor, surfaceman, plasterer, labourer, just some indication of the wealth of different talents and industries and businesses around. The property was owned for many years by a meal dealer, John Grant, and later for many years by Mrs. Mary Grant. John Grant, Kildorach, was the principal meal dealer in Grantown. Inevitably, many with Grant's surname would have a by-name to identify them, often recalling an occupation, a location, or a feature or place. In this case, Kildorach, after a local farm. During the desperate famines of 1847, dealers in Grantown planned selling meal to Lochaber merchants. A protest mob quickly gathered, without the benefit of Facebook, to prevent the transaction. Though a force of special constables was sent to quell the riot, the Grantown mob won the day, not just securing their precious meal, but saving the ringleaders from arrest and imprisonment. And it's rumoured that the Lochaber merchant's cart still lies in the deepest pool below the Old Spey Bridge. Traditional focus for farming today, of course, is the farmer's show, highlight of the agricultural calendar. Another important industry, going back long before the foundation of the new town, was that of timber. Timber had been floated down the Spey since the 15th century, and whilst transport is now quite different, it's still an important industry for the area's economy. Here we have the earliest softwood structure to have survived anywhere in Britain, St Castle Grant. Constructed in the 16th century from straight grain timbers of fine quality, up to 18 foot long, 14 inches in diameter, plainly grown from closely spaced trees from Abernethy and floated downstream. Timber for Grantown's first house was likewise floated down the Spey and landed at what's now known as the bathing pool and taken by cart up to the site in Grantown. Seafields, and that's just struggling for the enlargement, but wondrous group of four gentlemen. Seafields were particularly important in Scotland's story of the timber industry. Sir James drained and planted the ground to the south of Grantown, including Kilnshaw Woods and Church Wood. He also oversaw the planting of Milton Wood. Francis William, his successor, planted over 31 million trees, and John Charles carried on that tradition. It's not surprising that wood managers and factors were important. For example, here we have John Smith, the factor, Grantown, 1862 to 1910, John Grant Smith, the factor, Elgin, 1910 to 1942. Next, the Reverend William Thompson, author of a very valuable for us local manuscript, and son of the wood manager, and John Grant Thompson, wood manager, on the right from 1861 to 1910. One Grantown business, and I would love to be able to get the original of that photograph. That's enlarged from a tiny, tiny little picture on an early walk guide, and somewhere there's that original photograph or others that I would love to be able to see and get a copy of, so we could have a really better copy. But that's the Kilnshaw sawmill, and it dates back to 1771, following an agreement between John Moore, boring miller at Rothiemurchus, and James Grant of Grant. Now that's nothing to do with the tales that he told in the pub, it was to do with his job, because originally the mill was involved in boring out lengths of pine, which when joined together made pipes for fresh and waste water. Grantown's first piped water was delivered by wooden pipes, a sample of which can be seen in the museum, and some of which ended up under the streets of London for their sewers. In later life, the mill turned out birchwood bobbins for coats of paisley. With the coming of the railway, alas, no more, much changed, not least the transport of timber and the supply of coal. It also brought summer visitors and the start of a whole new industry, tourism. It also created a demand for a wider range of more upmarket products, some of which was met by Beal and Piper. They established a factory, a big red building I believe it was, at the lower end of Forest Road to make furniture. Other industries were helped by the growth of the town in the railway age, such as building, And here we see the builders for the Royal Bank of Banking. And there is an 1860s piece of a photograph showing Kilfoyle's Bank, Grantown's first bank, in the square. And of course, fishing. One other perhaps surprising industry, and one which is now strictly illegal, was mussel fishing and the hunt for spey pearls, much valued and for generations have been and sold locally. And we had a wonderful talk, some of you may have been at, on the story of mussels. Another photograph that didn't like to be enlarged too much, but you can perhaps just make it out. In the sort of top right corner are the nissen huts of the Remy. During the war, Grantown took on what was a most unexpected role. It became one of Scotland's 2 military repair depots, and a Remy camp was established. And one of its legacies was the empty nissen huts left behind, and these became the home for several of Grantown's industries, not only the established building industry and meat production, but new industries such as IT, knitwear and engineering. And amongst Grantown's many industries, lastly tonight but not least, tourism. And that is a big story on its own. But for example, this hotel, bringing our story the full circle. Hotel with enormous benefits for the whole community, not least our society, who very much appreciate the wonderful facilities that we have here. So just an insight into some of Grantown's industrial past. Next Sunday morning, and it is in the morning, a wee change of date, at 10 o'clock outside the museum, we'll be having a walk around some of these places, looking at the sites, looking at some of the stories and so on, and anyone's welcome to come join us. Before then, we've got a walk on part of a programme of Wandering Wednesdays, and this is in association with Eco Adventure, who have this most wonderful buggy, which if somebody, and we can only manage one person on it at a time of course, but if somebody can't manage to walk the whole route, we have this available, providing we get prior notice, to take people around. And that will simply be a woodland walk, looking at some of the various features of interest. There are several more walks coming up as part of the Highland Architectural Festival, and John there can tell you more about those, and there's a note of them on the desk, I think, out there. If not, I've got one. So thank you very much for that. You really are a very well behaved audience, but I do appreciate that. Nobody heckled.